Hi there, my name is Charlie DeShulo, and today I'm with Johan Lenox. So, when talking about your music, how would you describe your sound?
It's a good question. I mean, it's obviously I use a lot of orchestral instruments in my music, but I also use 808s and trap drums on occasion, and I sing. So, but then I also feature a lot of rappers and singers on those records. So I'd say eclectic, if anything.
So, when you talk about orchestral, um, I know you created Beethoven. Do you think you could talk about sort of the creation of Beethoven?
Sure, yeah. My friend Yuga Kohler and I actually met him because we used to study on the weekends at New England Conservatory in Boston, and then later at Tanglewood in Western Massachusetts. So I've known him for a long time, and we both grew up like a couple towns away from each other, northwest of the city. He had followed like the path through being an orchestral conductor all the way, while I had sort of put classical music a bit on the back burner and focused on producing for pop and hip hop artists. And so he had this orchestra and had this idea that he wanted to do something around Kanye West music with this orchestra. And I think he just reached out to me being like, how you been, man? Like, this, I think this would be a cool idea. Like, what do you think? And kind of maybe seeking my advice on some level, just as someone who is on the other side of that world now. And then together we kind of just came up with what it ended up being, which was this juxtaposition of Kanye West music with Beethoven pieces performed by this 60-piece orchestra. And we did it in LA a couple times, then we did it in New York at Lincoln Center. And it also had a bit of a TED Talk component to it almost, where we would talk in between the pieces and just tried to really tell this story about why, as classical composers, we were so intrigued by Kanye's music and why we thought it kind of, in some ways, represented a continuation of some of the compositional stuff that our favorite classical composers have been doing before.
Do you think it'll ever return?
I'm going to do a lot more with orchestra stuff, and we had some ideas that I think. Well, we did that, and then we did a K-pop one later, which was cool. And I think what we wanted to do, sort of going forward, was instead of contextualizing existing pop and hip hop music as if it were classical, and sort of trying to make the argument that it stands up as classical, and to instead, especially now that I'm sort of more plugged into the world of producing and being an artist, to instead just use like our relationships with some of these artists and actually get them to write new stuff for an orchestra instead of just taking their, basically like let them write music specifically for this setting rather than taking music they've already written for a different setting and sort of transposing it to this. So that was like our next big concept. We were talking to like James Blake, and we wanted to maybe like, FK Twigs, these people like that. That would have happened in 2020, fall 2020. So it didn't happen, obviously, but we're sort of working on stuff like that. So I think that's where that particular concept, I'm probably going to try to go with it next.
You've met Kanye West before, correct? After Beethoven?
Yes.
So can you tell me about your first time meeting him?
Yeah. Mike Dean had found Beethoven. I think someone tagged him in it on Twitter. And Mike Dean is one of Kanye's longtime collaborators. And Mike had me working on some others. He had me working on this dude named Designer for a bit, and then he had me working on when Kanye did the 5 albums in 5 weeks in 2018. He had me do these sort of like replaying this big orchestral and choral sample in one of the songs on the Nas record, and then that went well. So we just ended up doing a lot more. And the final album in that 5 was Tiana Taylor, and during that period, he brought me in to kind of just get Kanye's like vision for the album, and we sort of applied that to how I was arranging strings for it and some vocal textures and a bunch of just little production moments that ended up on that album. And it was kind of interesting because I did a lot of it remotely. I came in a few times, but a lot of it I was just doing from home, because it's like I need to be able to record these string players when I was doing strings and stuff, and I need to be able to record my vocals, and therefore I needed like a recording setup. And like with everyone crammed in the studio in North Hollywood, like it was just not. It's like I could have done stuff on a laptop outside on a picnic table with a bunch of people that were set up there, but it was just easier for me to bring like string players in and out. So it's just like a kind of like every 3 hours I'd be like texting one of the violin players I knew, like, hey, can you just come over and just do this one other thing for this kind of thing? Like, I feel like it's gonna be worth it, I'll just give you like $100. Just come over and do your, just help me, and we'll figure out like what it looks like later, and all ended up working out. But
So what is your favorite song on the album and why?
that's a good question. I mean, I think it's definitely evolved a lot as the process kind of went on. Like, the closer I've gotten to finishing it, it's like, there's like new features that came in, or new production, or like there's a song called What Happening. That's the first song on the album, which is called that because I was in a TikTok with Ty Dolla $ign and like accidentally said What Happening instead of What's Happening. And I just decided to be a funny way to retitle the song. And then this dude, Che Pope, who I met through that Kanye orbit, I played him the album, and he's just like a really great mentor to me. He's actually from Boston too. And he gave me sort of some advice about the album, and one of his big suggestions was moving that song, which used to be like third from the end to the beginning. And the album takes like a really strong narrative, like every song kind of moves the story forward into the next song, and like tells this sort of continuous linear thing. So I think when I moved that song to the front, I did solve a lot of problems musically, which I think was what he was trying to do, which is sort of the most important thing, I think. But then I had to kind of change the lyrics of it to make sense, so that it's sort of like an introductory track to the problems sort of I'm trying to solve in this album. And then sort of the last piece on that, also I should mention there's a choir piece on that I wrote and recorded with the Brooklyn Youth Chorus, which is just cool. And I think that's just like, that's probably the most like unique thing on here, because like I do have obviously a ton of strings and stuff and woodwinds and all that, but it's like a lot of artists do use those types of instruments. But having like a sort of classical children's chorus singing like full-on classical parts and stuff in the middle of sort of song with rap drums and stuff, I think is a cool combination of elements. And then the final piece was this dude Casey, who I actually met through 070 Shake, and who also was involved in some of that kind of stuff. And he did this verse that I think is really interesting and introspective, and probably like of all the verses I have on the album from various people, like that's probably the one that's most topically related to the album, and just the questions of like trying to figure out how to be a person, and then how to grow up and all that type of stuff. And I think it ended up coming together in this thing that I couldn't have expected, the combination of him and the choir saying they've been feeling older, and just all together, I think it's this really cool thing that really embodies all the different aspects of the album, I think.
For your next album, what is like a dream collab?
Yeah, I mean, I think like there's a couple. Like I'd really love to get Tizo Touchdown to do something. I know he's a big fan of my music, and we've worked a little bit on his stuff, but I definitely think that would be really cool. Gene Dawson is another artist that I really like, who I've done a little bit with, but yeah, they're both just really interesting, kind of blending different genres and like rock elements and stuff. I'm definitely gonna do more kind of rock type drums and stuff on the next album, but I think I'm also just going to kind of probably rein it in a bit in terms of features. Or if I do get a lot of features, they'll probably be like newer artists or something. I'm proud of the collection of people I assembled on this album. And I do think they all sound amazing. And I think they definitely sort of, reflect a lot of the artists that I've really enjoyed working with. But it is also just like, there was a version of this album at one point that didn't have any features on it at all, and it's like, I think that my music does stand on its own as well. And I think maybe it's worth it for me to try to just demonstrate that by doing something like that. But we'll see. I'll probably like be a little more selective. I think there's like 8 features on this album so far, or total. So I think it maybe got a little out of hand. But I also like, a lot of my favorite Kanye records and stuff are just covered in features too. I mean, he doesn't always credit them as features, but I do like the feeling of just having all these different vocal textures weaving in and out in a song, so I feel like maybe there's different ways to achieve that, but just chasing people down for a verse and then to show up for a video and then to post about it. It's just like, I don't like relying on other people that much. I feel like I like being self-sufficient.
Do you think you could tell me about how growing up inside of Massachusetts influenced your music style?
Yeah. I mean, definitely the lyrics. I mean, the whole thing is really just about the suburbs around Boston. And, there's like a song where I mention the red line, and there's a song where I mention getting high in the woods. These are on old EPs and stuff, but the woods are like the Fells, which is in Winchester, and I think Stoneham and a couple other towns, Medford maybe, I don't know. So yeah, there's a lot of these like specific touch points, and I think I try to speak to something that's kind of universal about like just growing up in the suburbs in America in general. And I think I lived a very sort of sheltered suburban life where it seemed like there was pretty much one path to adulthood, which is just sort of like go to college, get a job, get married, have a kid, buy a house, have a picket fence, whatever. It's like it was very much that kind of vibe of the town. And I do think there's something really charming about that, but it's also just a thing that isn't a reality for like almost anyone anywhere in the country anymore. And I think I'm trying to square these sort of bigger issues that I see in the country with this sort of much more personal experience I have growing up outside of Boston, and just trying to come up with some explanation of why I feel like things are just way more confused and directionless than I think we anticipated as kids. So I think certainly there's a song called I'll Censor It, but F This Town, like that entire song is about growing up in suburban Boston. And I think but it's also like a love letter to that experience. Like it's not really like, ooh, this town was really bad. It's much more just like every town that you grow up in is really bad when you're growing up in it. No one wants to grow up in a small town, just, or really anywhere probably for that matter. Like just growing up stinks. So I think that's really more what that song's about. But I think it's just hopefully imbued with this sense of the suburban, whatever. And I filmed a lot of my videos, especially on the last EP, the Cancel the Party EP. Like that entire run of videos was all filmed in and around like Woburn and Winchester and stuff. So
What has been the highlight of your career up to this point?
well, my like long-term interests are in trying to find ways of putting contemporary classical music into like the mainstream of American culture. This is something I've been into since like high school. I was on this show in Boston's classical music radio show called From the Top on NPR, and was saying this even then. So I've been pretty consistent about that. I think the path has changed a bit since I got into doing this type of hip hop and pop music, but I think I just sort of gravitated towards that music because I wanted to be near or at where it felt like the center of sort of culture was, or where the most cutting edge stuff was happening that was having the biggest impact on just culture across America. And I just feel like hip hop music is where that is. I don't think there's really any question about that. Maybe even across all types of media, but certainly within music. So I think that was a really good choice to switch into that stuff, even though it was really scary at the time. I think it's been kind of borne out. And there's a few ways that that's happened already, like on this tour with 070 Shake, like on most of the major shows, like the Big Night Live one in Boston, we did it. And the 4 nights I'm doing in LA this week, we're going to do it. Having me, in addition to the like 30 minutes of my own music that I do, where I'm singing stuff off the album and the EPs, that I then come back out on stage right afterwards and do 15 minutes of just straight up contemporary classical music of the kind I was writing in school and professionally before I started doing this. But it's just really loud and there's lights and stuff. But we have the violins on stage, I'm playing the piano, and it's literally a piece that I wrote right before we went on tour. And just seeing that there's kids that want to listen to that music, I think really validates what I'm trying to do with my life, because I believe there's kids who want to listen to that too. It just has to be sort of presented in the right context and, just entertaining enough just as a piece of media that people will enjoy it. But these, people are like watching and screaming and cheering for like 15 or 20 minutes of just straight up chamber music from someone they've never even heard of for the most part at these shows. Like, to me, that's like the closest I've ever been to where I want to ultimately go. So I think that, and then maybe some of sort of what happened with the Beethoven thing too, where we just had like the youngest and most diverse audience like Lincoln Center's ever had at an orchestra concert, just really enraptured by it and not being like pandered to in any way. I think that both of those things, while they're not the final version of what I want to do, they're both like the closest I've ever gotten. So I feel like, to me, those are the things that matter the most to me.
For your tour, would you ever come back to Boston?
I'm probably going to work on doing a solo show, maybe me and a couple other artists in Boston before the end of the year, regardless of what touring I get on. I mean, this tour is 070 Shake's tour, so it's like she happened to have 2 nights in Boston, which was amazing for me. But, I'm trying to be opening for some more tours also and just kind of building fans that way. So with those tours, it's kind of just like up to them whether they've routed it through Boston. But I mean, if they're going through major cities, they will go to Boston. So God willing, I'll be back in Boston several times before the end of the year for some shows.
That's awesome, man. I hope to see you at one of your shows.
Definitely.
So what do you believe like motivates you?
I think just that end goal. I think it's just, of trying to do something interesting with classical music that'll have an impact on American pop culture. And I think I don't know. I've cared about it a long enough time that I don't think I'm ever going to not care about that. And I think part of why I care about it is, I mean, fundamentally, it's probably just had to do with it's just the earliest passion that I had, and I just want it to be the greatest version of itself that it can. And I think I'm sure lots of people would say, like, well, why is it my job to rewrite the entire thing in my image? Which I don't think it is, but I do think like a lot of other classical musicians agree that they wish they were playing to an audience that was a little more diverse, a little bit younger, and just a lot more engaged and excited about what's going on, and that what they were doing really had an impact. And if they do a good job or they do a bad job, they can actually tell the difference because of whether people care, you know? Like, I just think it's really hard to soldier on through anything in a world that's so insular where it doesn't really feel like anything you do actually makes a difference to anybody's life. And I think that that's how a lot of people in classical music feel. And I think I want to do it for them too, you know, and I just, that's just, and it's a conversation I have often, like as we go from city to city doing these shows, and I always meet violinists. They're like, oh my God, that'd be so great if that was a world that existed. And like, it doesn't have to be me, but I just don't see anyone else really pushing at it hard enough to do it. And so because of that, I kind of feel like it's this sort of like mission that I'm on. And that's what really keeps me going. I think on a more short-term day-to-day basis, what keeps me from just like succumbing to the difficulty of it is just sort of what I said earlier, of just the feeling of doing something and having it be good when you're done, and having the fact that it was good matter to somebody, you know? And I think that whether it's a string arrangement or producing for Shake or prepping for my live show and then getting to see the audience react in real time, or dropping a song and hopefully it gets some, you know, love on streaming or whatever, which is like less exciting because it's just numbers. But I think definitely the personal interactions I have with people where they're like, whoa, this was so good, whether that's an audience member or a fellow producer or an artist. I mean, that makes me excited. It keeps me that in a short-term way. It's not, I don't think it's the be all end all, but on a day-to-day basis, like getting some kind of feedback that what I'm doing is like having some impact on someone is really important.
Lastly, my last question for you: what is next for you? Can you tell me like a little bit about your next album, if you're working on it? Or
Yeah, I've got a few projects. I mean, the next project, there's so many things all the time. I mean, probably the most immediately thing I'm going to do next, I'm not 100% sure, but almost certainly going to do, is just like a strings and vocals only version of this album. Sort of instead of a deluxe album, it'll just be kind of like a remix album that's just like no drums, and just the whole thing is just sort of chamber music and vocals, which I did for some of my older songs on something called Chamber Johan, which is just some of random songs that I picked to do that for. This will be like just this album in a slightly different version, and there'll be an extended version of the Mr. Hudson one, Burning Sky, which we've already made and a lot of people have been asking for, so that'll be cool. And then there's another album that I worked on with a couple of classical people, Ellen Reed, Yuga Kohler. Yuga's the person I did Beethoven with. And then Ellen Reed actually just had a premiere at the Boston Symphony. So she's a really, really well-regarded composer who I really like. And then we brought a bunch of other classical composers in, and then we also got some rappers and some singers, and made this whole album just entirely over the internet during quarantine, basically like over the past year or two. And this is going to come out hopefully by the end of the year, and it's got just all sorts of like Vic Mensa and Masego and 645 AR and Tommy Genesis and Danny Brown and people like that. So it's just, and then it's got some great classical composers like Marcos Balter and Bryce Dessner and I don't know, a bunch of people. Just it's I don't know. I'm really excited about that. That one's way less commercial than this album I've just made. If that word means anything. I mean, it's like there aren't pop songs on it. It's very just weird, constantly evolving instrumental textures. The vocals there's no choruses anywhere. It's just all just free flowing, chaotic, quarantine inspired music. But I'm really excited for that. It's called ISO Monstrosity. And then, yeah, and then right now I'm working on my next solo album, which will probably come out right after that. So it's just kind of, I want to get on another tour after this one because it's been the best experience of my life so far, I think. And I want to get some of those orchestra concerts like the Lincoln Center stuff happening again, hopefully, something like that. But I don't know. It's a lot of stuff.